At 25 years old, Connor Sturgeon looked like someone who had already won at life. On paper, his future was flawless. He graduated from the University of Alabama with dual degrees in finance and economics, followed by a master's degree, all completed by December of 2020. He was clean-cut, articulate, and widely regarded as highly intelligent. Not long after graduation, he secured a position at Old National Bank in downtown Louisville, Kentucky. To his coworkers, Connor was quiet, polite, professional. He kept his head down, did his work, and rarely drew attention to himself. His family was close and supportive. Nothing about him suggested instability, violence, or danger. But beneath that polished exterior, something had been unraveling for years. Connor had been struggling with severe depression long before anyone realized how deep it ran. He had experienced suicidal thoughts in the past, thoughts so serious that during a family beach vacation, he once walked toward the ocean contemplating whether he should drown himself. His parents knew he was having mental health difficulties, but they believed he was managing. They never imagined the darkness inside him had reached a point of no return. By early April 2023, Connor's internal world had collapsed completely. On April 4th, just 6 days before the attack, Connor walked into a store and purchased an AR-15 style rifle for under $500. He also bought ammunition and accessories. The entire transaction took less than 45 minutes. No alarms, no red flags. No one asked questions. That night, Connor opened a journal. What he wrote would later send chills through investigators. He documented how shocked he was by how easy it had been to acquire a weapon, despite his mental health history. He wrote with bitterness and disbelief, questioning why no safeguards existed to stop someone like him. Over the next several days, his journal entries grew darker. He wrote about feeling empty, invisible, and powerless, about believing that politicians ignored mental health care and gun access until tragedy forced their attention. In one entry, he acknowledged that his coworkers did not deserve what he was planning, but he believed their deaths might finally make people listen. He wrote that perhaps it would take the deaths of upper-class professionals to spark real change. To Connor, this was no longer just violence. It was a statement. On the morning of April 10th, 2023, Connor arrived at the Old National Bank branch before it opened to the public. It was a Monday. Inside his gym bag were the rifle, ammunition, eye protection, and ear protection. He went to his office, changed clothes, and prepared himself. Shortly after 8:30 a.m., he encountered a colleague in the hallway. He opened fire. Moments later, he turned toward a conference room where 13 employees were gathered for a routine morning meeting. As panic erupted and people tried to flee, Connor fired repeatedly. The attack was relentless, calculated, cold. Even more disturbing, Connor live-streamed the entire shooting on Instagram. 5 people were killed: Josh Barrick, Tommy Elliott, Juliana Farmer, Jim Tutt, and Dean Schwerin. 8 others were wounded, including a Louisville Metro police officer who was shot in the head while responding. Within minutes, officers arrived on scene. Officer Corey Galloway engaged Connor in a brief but intense exchange of gunfire. Less than 10 minutes after the first shot was fired, Connor Sturgeon was struck multiple times by police and pronounced dead at the scene. The entire attack lasted approximately 8 minutes. The aftermath sent shockwaves through Kentucky and across the nation. One of the victims, Tommy Elliott, was a close friend and mentor to Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear. During a press conference, the governor struggled to hold back tears as he spoke about the loss. Investigators recovered Connor's journal from his home. Page after page revealed meticulous planning, ideological anger, and a deep sense of despair. Tests showed no evidence of brain injury, despite Connor having suffered multiple concussions during high school sports. There was no sign of substance abuse, no criminal record, just a deeply troubled young man who passed every background check. In messages sent shortly before the shooting, Connor told a friend that he felt suicidal and wanted to take as many people with him as possible. In November 2023, Louisville Metro Police released a 64-page report detailing the findings. Investigators concluded that Connor's motive was largely political, rooted in outrage over gun laws and mental health care access. In his final writings, he sarcastically thanked the National Rifle Association, claiming they had made his plan possible. For the families of the victims, none of this brought comfort. 5 people went to work that morning expecting an ordinary day and never came home. Connor Sturgeon's name was added to a growing list of workplace shooters whose actions reignited debates about prevention, intervention, and accountability. But for those left behind, policy discussions meant little compared to the permanent absence at dinner tables, empty chairs at family gatherings, and unanswered questions that would linger forever. On the morning of December 1st, 1997, no one questioned the quiet freshman carrying a bundle wrapped in a blanket. Michael Carneal was only 14 years old, a small-framed boy from West Paducah, Kentucky. He didn't fit the image most people associate with a school shooter. He wasn't openly violent. He wasn't failing classes. He came from a stable, loving family. His parents were involved in his life. His older sister, Kelly, drove him to school most mornings. From the outside, Michael appeared ordinary. But internally, he was unraveling. Michael struggled with severe anxiety, depression, and paranoia. He felt isolated and misunderstood, convinced that classmates were talking about him behind his back. He believed people were watching him through vents and windows. At home, he sometimes covered bathroom vents with towels, terrified someone was spying on him. At the time, no formal diagnosis had been made, but later evaluations would reveal symptoms consistent with paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that had gone unnoticed until it manifested in the most catastrophic way possible. That Monday morning, Michael told his sister that the bundle on his lap was part of a school project. She believed him. No alarms went off. No suspicions were raised. Inside the blanket were 2 rifles and 2 shotguns, stolen from a neighbor's garage. Hidden in his backpack was a fully loaded .22 caliber pistol. When they arrived at Heath High School, shortly before 8 a.m., Kelly dropped her brother off and drove away, unaware that she would spend the rest of her life replaying that moment. Michael walked into the school and headed toward the lobby where a small student prayer group was finishing its morning meeting. As they said, "Amen," Michael inserted earplugs into his ears, reached into his backpack, and pulled out the pistol. Then he opened fire. 10 shots rang out in rapid succession. Students screamed and scattered, diving for cover, as chaos erupted in seconds. When the gunfire stopped, 8 students had been shot. 3 teenage girls lay dying on the floor: Nicole Hadley, 14 years old, Jessica James, 17, and Casey Stengel, just 15. 5 others were wounded. Among them was Missy Jenkins, who would be paralyzed from the chest down for the rest of her life. Another student, Holland Holm, was shot in the head but survived without permanent brain damage. The entire attack lasted less than a minute. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. Michael dropped the gun, stood still, and waited. When police arrived minutes later, they found him crying, asking officers to kill him. He was taken into custody without resistance. When asked why he had done it, Michael had no clear answer. Later, he would say voices in his head told him to steal the guns and shoot. He spoke of feeling unloved, of being bullied, of rumors spreading about his sexuality. But none of it formed a coherent explanation. His mental illness had distorted reality so severely that violence felt inevitable to him. Because of the severity of the crime, Michael Carneal was charged as an adult. At just 14 years old, he faced 3 counts of murder and 5 counts of attempted murder. In 1998, he entered a guilty plea, hoping to spare the victims' families from reliving the horror through a trial. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years, the harshest sentence allowed under Kentucky law for a juvenile at the time. Michael began serving his sentence in a youth detention facility before being transferred to the Kentucky State Reformatory when he turned 18. Over the years, he made multiple attempts to overturn his conviction, arguing that he was too mentally ill to understand his plea. Each appeal was denied. While incarcerated, Michael was formally diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and placed on psychiatric medication. Prison records noted that he continued hearing voices, sometimes urging him to harm himself. Therapists described his prognosis as poor, though he expressed remorse in interviews. In 2002, he told reporters that he had only been thinking of himself that day, that he hadn't understood the consequences, that there was no simple explanation for what he had done. In September 2022, after nearly 25 years behind bars, Michael Carneal became eligible for parole, one of the first school shooters in American history to reach that milestone. His parents supported his release, promising to supervise him and ensure continued mental health treatment. His attorney argued that Michael was no longer the boy who committed the crime, that he was a sick child who deserved compassion. But for the victims and their families, time had changed nothing. Missy Jenkins Smith, who had publicly forgiven Michael years earlier, opposed his release. Forgiveness, she said, did not erase consequences. She spoke about her own life sentence paralysis without parole and questioned why the man who caused it should ever walk free. Nearly every family member who testified asked the parole board to deny release. Only Holland Holm, the student shot in the head who survived, said he believed Michael deserved another chance. Michael appeared via video conference. He admitted he still heard voices, sometimes even days before the hearing. When asked how the board could be sure he wouldn't act on them, he said he had learned to ignore them. Then, he added something chilling. Some days he said he believed he deserved to die for what he did. Other days, he thought he might still be able to do some good. On September 26, 2022, the Kentucky Parole Board unanimously voted to deny parole. Under state law, that decision meant Michael Carneal would never be eligible for parole again, effectively converting his sentence to life without parole. Michael responded quietly, "Yes, ma'am." Today, he remains incarcerated at Little Sandy Correctional Complex in eastern Kentucky. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars for a crime committed at 14 years old. The Heath High School shooting occurred more than a year before Columbine, marking one of the earliest chapters in America's ongoing crisis of school violence. For the community of West Paducah, the wounds never fully healed. Lockers were replaced, floors were cleaned, but memory lingers. And for those who survived December 1st, never truly ended. For nearly 2 decades, people around Donald Harvey noticed a pattern. Patients seemed to die when he was around. At first, it was a dark joke whispered in hospital hallways. Nurses would exchange glances. Doctors would shake their heads. Someone would say it half seriously, half laughing. Another one passed on Harvey's shift. They even gave him a nickname, the Angel of Death. No one imagined it was true. Donald Harvey was born in 1,952 inches, Hamilton, Ohio, but he was raised in Boonville, Kentucky, a small Appalachian town marked by poverty and rigid religious values. His parents were struggling tobacco farmers, deeply devout Baptists, trying to raise 3 children in difficult conditions. Donald was intelligent and did well in school, but he was socially isolated, withdrawn, and often felt invisible. At 18, he dropped out of high school and left Boonville behind. He moved to London, Kentucky, where he found work as an orderly at Marymount Hospital in 1970. To most people, it looked like a modest but respectable job in healthcare. To Donald Harvey, it was something else entirely. It was access. His first confirmed victim was an 8-year-old stroke patient named Logan Evans. According to Harvey's later confession, Evans had smeared feces on him during care. Enraged, Harvey smothered the elderly man with a plastic sheet and a pillow. He listened with a stethoscope as the heartbeat faded. Then he cleaned the room, dressed the body in a fresh gown, and calmly notified the nurse on duty. No one questioned it. Old patients died all the time. That death opened a door Harvey would never close. Over the next 10 months at Marymount Hospital, he killed at least a dozen patients. Some deaths he claimed were acts of anger. Others he framed as mercy. But as investigators would later determine, the truth was far simpler. He liked the control. Harvey enjoyed deciding who lived and who died. He experimented constantly, smothering victims with pillows or plastic bags, turning off oxygen supplies, injecting cyanide or arsenic into food or directly into IV lines, using incorrect catheter sizes to cause internal injuries that led to fatal infections. In one especially horrifying case, he inserted a coat hanger through a catheter, puncturing a patient's bladder and bowel, sending them into shock. His victims were men and women, mostly elderly, often cardiac patients, vulnerable people who depended entirely on the medical staff around them. Their deaths blended seamlessly into the background noise of hospital life. After Marymount, Harvey moved from facility to facility, the Veterans Administration Medical Center in Cincinnati, Drake Memorial Hospital, and others throughout Kentucky and Ohio. Everywhere he went, the pattern followed. Patients died. Coworkers noticed. Some joked about it. Some felt uneasy. But the medical community at the time had no formal system for identifying or investigating healthcare workers suspected of harming patients. There were no safeguards, no databases, no protocols. And so Donald Harvey kept killing. He grew bolder. He joked to nurses about getting rid of another one. He stole tissue samples from morgues to study. He spoke casually about death in ways that made people uncomfortable, but never uncomfortable enough to report him. It wasn't until April 1987 that the illusion finally cracked. A patient at Drake Memorial Hospital died unexpectedly, and during the autopsy, a pathologist noticed something unmistakable: the smell of cyanide. Police obtained a search warrant for Harvey's apartment. Inside, they found poisons, syringes, and records, that suggested a scale of violence almost impossible to comprehend. When confronted, Harvey tried to deflect blame, but the evidence was overwhelming. On August 11th, 1987, Donald Harvey sat down with investigators and began to talk. At first, he confessed to 33 killings. Then the number climbed. By the time he finished, he claimed responsibility for as many as 87 deaths over a 17-year period. Prosecutors were stunned. Serial killers of this magnitude were rare. Healthcare workers who systematically murdered patients were almost unheard of. Psychiatric evaluations concluded that Harvey was sane. He understood right from wrong. He simply didn't care. To avoid the death penalty, Harvey agreed to plead guilty. In Kentucky, he received 8 life sentences plus 20 years. In Ohio, he was sentenced to 4 consecutive terms of 20 years to life. Officially, he was convicted of 37 murders, though dozens more were suspected. For years, Donald Harvey faded into obscurity behind prison walls. Occasionally, he gave interviews. In them, he continued to describe many of his killings as acts of mercy, claiming he was easing suffering. Former prosecutors rejected that narrative outright. They pointed to victims who were not terminally ill, to the rage-fueled killings, to Harvey's own admissions that he enjoyed the power. Mercy was a lie. What Harvey felt was domination. On March 28, 2017, Harvey was found in his cell at the Toledo Correctional Institution in Ohio, brutally beaten. He died 2 days later from blunt force trauma. He was 64 years old. Another inmate, James Elliott, was charged and later convicted. Elliott reportedly told others he had grown up near families of Harvey's victims and felt compelled to deliver his own version of justice. Some families felt a grim sense of closure. Others felt nothing at all. One prosecutor summed it up bluntly: Donald Harvey died the same way many of his victims did, helpless, confined to a bed at the mercy of someone stronger. Today, his name appears in criminology textbooks and true crime documentaries as one of the most prolific healthcare killers in American history. A living reminder of what happens when systems fail, warning signs are ignored, and absolute power goes unchecked. He drove nearly 3 hours in the dark. From Indianapolis to a quiet neighborhood in Versailles, Kentucky, Ronald Exantis didn't wander. He didn't get lost. He arrived with purpose. Before dawn on December 7, 2015, he broke into a family home, climbed the stairs with a kitchen knife in his hand, and walked into a child's bedroom. What followed would destroy a family and expose a legal system many believe failed catastrophically. Ronald Exantis was 42 years old, a licensed dialysis nurse from Indianapolis. He had no criminal record. To coworkers, he appeared competent and stable. Nothing in his background suggested he was capable of what happened that morning. Later, Exantis would claim he was experiencing a severe psychotic episode, late-onset schizophrenia, that caused him to completely lose touch with reality. Whether that explanation tells the full story remains debated. What is not debated is what the Tipton family endured. Dean Tipton woke to screaming. His 6-year-old son Logan was crying out from upstairs. Dean ran toward the noise and encountered Exantis in the hallway armed with a knife. The two men fought violently. Despite being stabbed himself, Dean managed to wrestle the weapon away and pin Exantis to the ground until police arrived. But the damage was already done. Logan Tipton had been stabbed multiple times. Paramedics rushed him to medical care, but it was too late. He died shortly after his father holding him one final time. Dean's daughters were also attacked. 11-year-old Coral Tipton called 911 as her family was being torn apart. Both girls survived, but with physical injuries and deep psychological scars. The Tipton family was shattered in minutes. Exantis was arrested at the scene and charged with murder and multiple counts of assault. During questioning, he admitted to the attack but claimed he had no memory of it, insisting he had been psychotic and disconnected from reality. At trial, mental health experts testified that Exantis had experienced a severe psychiatric break. Prosecutors argued something very different, that he had driven 3 hours, selected a home broken in, armed himself, and carried out a sustained attack actions that required planning and intent. In 2018, after a 6-day trial, the jury returned a verdict that stunned the courtroom. Ronald Exantis was found not guilty of murder by reason of insanity in Logan's death. At the same time, the jury found him guilty but mentally ill for the assaults on Dean and his daughters. The distinction suggested Exantis was legally insane at the moment Logan was killed, but mentally capable at other points during the same attack. The Tipton family struggled to understand how that was possible. Exantis appealed the verdict, arguing it was logically inconsistent. In 2020, the Kentucky Supreme Court upheld the decision, ruling that the jury could reasonably conclude his mental state fluctuated during the incident. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive 10-year terms, totaling 20 years in prison for the assaults. The murder charge carried no sentence. In court, Dean Tipton broke down. He could not comprehend how the man who confessed to killing his son could be deemed innocent of that specific crime. The family felt betrayed, but they believed at least Exantis would remain incarcerated for decades. They were wrong. Under Kentucky law, inmates can earn education and good behavior credits. Combined with a mandatory re-entry supervision statute, these credits allow certain offenders to be released early, even against the wishes of the parole board. In September 2025, Ronald Exantis appeared before the parole board. The board unanimously voted to keep him incarcerated, but the law stripped them of authority. On October 1, 2025, after serving less than 10 years of his 20-year sentence, Ronald Exantis was released. The Tipton family received minimal notification, no warning, no protection, no counseling support. News of the release spread quickly, triggering national outrage. How could a man tied to the death of a 6-year-old child be free? State officials scrambled for answers. The White House announced it would review the circumstances surrounding Exantis' release. Lawmakers faced intense pressure to explain a system that appeared to value procedure over human cost. Exantis was allowed to relocate to Florida under mandatory supervision. He was required to register as a convicted felon within 48 hours. He didn't. 8 days after his release, Exantis was arrested in Marion County, Florida, for violating the terms of his supervision. Extradition proceedings began to return him to Kentucky. Legal experts warned that even if reincarcerated, he would likely serve only a few more months before being released again, this time with no supervision at all. The Tipton family lived in fear. In response, Kentucky State Representative T.J. Roberts introduced Logan's Law legislation designed to close the loopholes that allowed Exantis' release. The proposed reforms included placing individuals found not guilty by reason of insanity into secure mental health facilities rather than standard prisons, restricting early release for violent offenders, and strengthening victim notification requirements. The Tiptons became vocal advocates. Dean Tipton told reporters he wasn't sure he could control his anger if he ever crossed paths with Exantis again. Coral Tipton described waking every morning, reliving the night her brother was taken from her. For the family, the most painful realization was this: Logan's life had been valued at less than a decade of incarceration. As of late 2025, Ronald Exantis remains in custody, pending resolution of his parole violation. Logan's Law is still under consideration. For the Tiptons, no piece of legislation will ever bring their son back. But they are determined that his death will mean something that no other family will be forced to learn the way they did: how easily justice can slip through the cracks. She left for the 4th of July weekend in 2015 and never came home. Crystal Rogers was 35 years old, a mother of 5 from Bardstown, Kentucky. On the surface, her life looked ordinary: work, family, small-town routines. But behind closed doors, things were complicated. Crystal shared a turbulent relationship with her boyfriend, Brooks Houck. They broke up and reconciled repeatedly. They had a 2-year-old son together. By the summer of 2015, the relationship was once again unraveling. On July 3rd, Crystal was last seen alive at Houck's family farm. 2 days later, her Chevrolet Impala was found abandoned along the Bluegrass Parkway. The keys were in the ignition. Her purse, phone, and personal belongings were still inside. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no explanation. Crystal had simply vanished. Her family knew immediately that something was wrong. Crystal was devoted to her children. She would never leave without telling someone. Suspicion quickly fell on Houck, who refused to cooperate fully with investigators. He denied involvement, but questions followed him everywhere he went. Bardstown was not a town accustomed to mysteries like this. Crystal's father, Tommy Ballard, became the face of the search. He organized volunteer efforts, gave interviews, and refused to let his daughter's name fade from public memory. But tragedy struck again in November 2016, when Tommy was shot and killed while hunting on family property. His death remains unsolved. Many believe it was connected to Crystal's disappearance. For Crystal's mother, Sherry Ballard, the loss was unbearable. First her daughter, then her husband. yet she refused to stop fighting. Years passed. Investigators searched Houck family property repeatedly. FBI agents were brought in. Cadaver dogs scoured the land. Cell phone data revealed suspicious gaps. Witnesses came forward with troubling stories. Still, prosecutors said they lacked enough evidence to move forward. For nearly a decade, no one was charged. But the case never truly went cold. Crystal's family kept pressure on law enforcement through social media interviews and public events. Slowly, cracks formed. New witnesses emerged. Old statements were re-examined. Investigators began connecting pieces that once seemed unrelated. In 2023, everything changed. Arrests were made not only Brooks Houck, but also Joseph Lawson, a former employee, and Joseph's father, Steve Lawson. Prosecutors alleged all three men participated in a conspiracy to end Crystal's life and conceal the crime. Steve Lawson was tried first in May 2025. Prosecutors presented evidence that he had been involved in discussions about disposing of Crystal's body and had helped cover up what happened. The jury found him guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with physical evidence. He was sentenced to 17 years in prison. Then came the joint trial of Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson in the summer of 2025. Over 10 days, more than 50 witnesses testified. Prosecutors built their case meticulously, using cell phone records, surveillance footage, expert testimony, and statements from people who claimed they had heard the defendants discuss Crystal as a problem that needed to be eliminated. One witness testified that Houck's mother, Rosemary, had asked someone to find a person who could get rid of Crystal. Rosemary and Houck's brother Nick were labeled unindicted co-conspirators. Cell phone data showed Rosemary's phone went dark for weeks around the time of Crystal's disappearance, suggesting she was using a burner device. Prosecutors argued Crystal was killed at the Houck family farm. Her body, they said, was hidden and disposed of. Despite years of searching, her remains were never recovered. On July 8, 2025, after just over 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts. Brooks Houck was convicted of murder and tampering with physical evidence. Joseph Lawson was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and evidence tampering. The courtroom erupted. Crystal's family wept. Outside, hundreds of community members gathered wearing pink Crystal's favorite color. For the first time in 10 years, Bardstown felt justice had arrived. Houck was sentenced to life in prison. Joseph Lawson received 25 years. Steve Lawson would remain behind bars. Appeals were filed, but the verdicts stood. And yet, for Sherry Ballard, victory felt incomplete. Crystal was still missing. Her body had never been found. Her final moments remained unknown. The family continues to hope that someone someday will reveal where Crystal's remains are so she can finally be brought home. Justice in this case took a decade, but it came, at least in the courtroom. She didn't show up for work on a Thursday morning in September 2024. For Kayla Blake, missing a shift was unthinkable. She was reliable, professional, and deeply committed to her job as a registered nurse at the Addiction Recovery Institute of America. When calls and messages went unanswered, a concerned coworker decided to drive to her home in Moorhead, Kentucky, to check on her. What they saw through the window would unravel a quiet neighborhood and expose a pattern of violence stretching back more than 20 years. Joshua William Cottrell was 44 years old. By 2024, he appeared to be rebuilding his life in Moorhead. He was dating Kayla, a 37-year-old nurse and devoted mother to her 3-year-old daughter, Kennedy McWhorter. Friends believed the three were forming a blended family. Cottrell even updated his social media to include photos with Kayla over the summer. From the outside, everything looked normal. But Joshua Cottrell carried a past Kayla may not have fully understood. In 2003, more than 2 decades earlier, Cottrell had been convicted of manslaughter in the death of a 6-year-old woman named Jen Ritchie Phillips in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. Court records showed that Cottrell admitted to killing Phillips, placing her body in a suitcase, and dumping it in a lake. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Years later, after serving most of that sentence, Cottrell was released and attempted to start over. By late 2023, he was in a relationship with Kayla Blake. For a time, things appeared stable. But on the morning of September 19, 2024, Kayla didn't arrive at work. When her coworker reached her home on South Spring Street and looked inside, it was immediately clear something was terribly wrong. Rowan County deputies arrived around 11 a.m. Inside the house, they found a scene of brutal violence. Kayla Blake was discovered in a back bedroom, suffering from multiple stab wounds and blunt force trauma. Across the hallway, her daughter Kennedy lay dead as well, also stabbed. Blood was found throughout the home, suggesting a struggle. Investigators quickly determined that the crime scene had been altered. The bodies appeared to have been moved after the attack, an indication someone had tried to obscure what happened. The coroner pronounced both victims dead at the scene. Kentucky State Police took over the investigation and immediately focused on Joshua Cottrell. He had been living with or frequently staying at the home, and after the killings, he was nowhere to be found. A statewide manhunt began. Just hours later, troopers located Cottrell at a hospital in Paducah, more than 200 miles away. Officers noticed blood on his clothing when they approached him. After receiving medical treatment, he was taken into custody. Cottrell was charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of tampering with physical evidence. Investigators alleged he had intentionally killed Kayla and Kennedy, then moved their bodies in an attempt to hide or delay discovery. The community of Moorhead was devastated. Kennedy had been a standout member of a youth softball team that had recently won a state championship. Teammates remembered her as bright, kind, and full of energy. Students at her middle school wore purple in her honor. A memorial appeared at the softball fields where she once played. Kayla's colleagues mourned the loss of a compassionate nurse who dedicated her life to helping people recover from addiction. Patients, co-workers, friends, and family struggled to process how such violence could happen on a quiet street where neighbors looked out for one another. In court, Cottrell pleaded not guilty. Legal experts noted that the case would likely take years to reach trial due to the severity of the charges and the complexity of the evidence. Prosecutors were expected to pursue maximum penalties, especially because one of the victims was a child. Cottrell's prior manslaughter conviction cast a long shadow over the case. Questions surfaced almost immediately. Should he have been released years earlier? Was his violent history properly considered? Could better supervision have prevented this tragedy? The law offered uncomfortable answers. Once someone completes their sentence and parole obligations, the system generally assumes rehabilitation. Unless new crimes are committed, the past is legally the past. Kayla may not have known the full extent of Cottrell's history when she began dating him. If she did, she may have believed, like many do, that people can change. As of late 2024, Joshua Cottrell remained incarcerated awaiting trial. Prosecutors continued building their case using blood evidence, crime scene analysis, and witness statements. The defense prepared to challenge every piece of evidence. For Kayla and Kennedy's families, the wait for justice had only just begun. No verdict would ever bring them back. No sentence could undo the damage. But accountability through the courts remained the only path forward. In Moorhead, flowers and notes still appeared at the softball fields. On South Spring Street, neighbors drove past a house that no longer felt like a home. And for many, the case became a haunting reminder that violence doesn't always arrive with warning signs. It sometimes walks quietly through the front door, carrying a past no one sees until it's too late. He was celebrating his 21st birthday on a warm summer night. Friends gathered on the front porch of an apartment in Lexington, Kentucky. There was laughter, music, and the careless optimism that comes with being young and convinced the future is wide open. Then, without warning, a single gunshot cracked through the darkness. Trent Juro collapsed instantly. The bullet struck him in the head. He never stood back up. It was July 17, 1994. Trent was a standout athlete at the University of Kentucky, a football player for the Wildcats, well-liked by teammates and coaches. He wasn't known to have enemies. He wasn't involved in crime. There was no argument, no confrontation, just one shot. Police arrived to a scene filled with confusion. No one saw the shooter. No one heard footsteps. There was no fleeing suspect. The angle and distance suggested the shot had been fired from far away, possibly hundreds of feet hidden in darkness. It felt deliberate, calculated, sniper-like. Investigators canvassed the area, interviewed witnesses, and explored every possible motive. Robbery made no sense. Nothing had been taken. There was no sign the shooter ever intended to approach the group. The randomness of the attack terrified the community. Then, the case went cold. Months turned into years. Trent's family waited for answers that never came. Birthdays passed. Seasons changed. The question remained unanswered. Who would do this, and why? 6 years later, in 2000, the silence finally broke. A woman came forward with a startling claim. She told police that her former boyfriend, Shane Ragland, had confessed to her that he was the one who shot Trent Juro. According to her statement, Raglan harbored a deep grudge against Trent, stemming from fraternity politics. Raglan believed Trent had played a role in blocking him from joining a fraternity at the University of Kentucky, something he felt humiliated by and obsessed over. Prosecutors now had a theory: resentment, rejection, a long-festering grievance that finally erupted in violence. But a confession made privately years after the fact was not enough. Investigators needed corroboration. They reopened the case, re-examined old witness statements, and searched for anyone who might have heard Raglan discuss the shooting. Slowly, pieces began to align. Witnesses recalled seeing Raglan in the area the night Trent was killed. Others came forward saying Raglan had made disturbing statements over the years, hinting at involvement. In 2002, Shane Raglan was formally charged with murder. At trial, prosecutors argued Raglan had deliberately targeted Trent, lying in wait and firing a single fatal shot driven by a petty but powerful grudge. The ex-girlfriend's testimony became the backbone of the case. The defense pushed back hard. They attacked her credibility, questioned her motives, and emphasized the lack of physical evidence. No weapon was ever recovered. No DNA linked Raglan to the scene. The case relied heavily on words spoken years earlier. The jury deliberated and convicted. Shane Raglan was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. For Trent's family, it was a moment of long-delayed relief. After 8 years of uncertainty, they finally had a name, a motive, and a conviction. But justice in this case was fragile. In 2006, the Kentucky Supreme Court overturned Raglan's conviction on procedural grounds. The court ruled that Raglan's constitutional rights had been violated during the trial due to issues with how certain evidence was handled. The conviction was vacated. The case was sent back and prosecutors faced a difficult choice. Retrying Raglan with the same evidence carried significant risk. Witness memories had faded. The case was already old, and the flaws identified by the Supreme Court could haunt a second trial. Instead, a plea deal was reached. Raglan pleaded guilty to second-degree manslaughter, a far lesser charge than murder. He was sentenced to time already served. After years behind bars, he walked free. For Trent's family, the outcome felt like a second loss. A man they believed had carried out a calculated killing served only a fraction of the time. Originally imposed, freed, not because of innocence but because of legal technicalities. The sense of injustice lingered. After his release, Raglan's name resurfaced in police reports. He was arrested multiple times on domestic violence charges in subsequent years, reinforcing concerns that he remained dangerous. Legally, however, the matter was settled. Double jeopardy protections meant Raglan could never again be tried for Trent Juro's death. The case gained national attention through television features and true crime programs, highlighting the frustration families feel when convictions collapse under procedural errors. To some, Raglan became a symbol of a system that values process over outcome. To others, he represented why constitutional protections exist to ensure no one is imprisoned unfairly. The truth may lie somewhere in between. More than 30 years later, Trent Juro's death remains a cautionary tale. A life ended in seconds, a motive rooted in something as trivial as fraternity rejection, a confession whispered years later, a conviction undone. For Trent's family, closure never truly arrived. They remember a son, an athlete, a young man whose life was stolen on the night he should have been celebrating. And in Lexington, the echo of that single gunshot still lingers, proof that sometimes justice isn't denied outright, but quietly eroded until what remains no longer feels like justice at all. She was only 3 years old. Trinity Randolph was wearing her favorite Disney Frozen outfit when someone knocked on her father's door in the middle of the afternoon. Seconds later, both she and her father would be lying on the ground, fatally wounded by gunfire. And years later, the man once convicted of pulling the trigger would walk back into court because the justice system itself had stumbled. On August 14, 2020, Brandon Waddles was at home on Kurt Avenue in Louisville, Kentucky. At 21 years old, Brandon was trying to build a better life for himself and his young daughter. Friends described him as devoted, protective, and determined to break away from the violence that surrounded parts of his neighborhood. That afternoon, someone lured him outside. Prosecutors would later argue that Kayvon Lawless, then 27, orchestrated the attack. Using his 7-year-old girlfriend as bait, Lawless allegedly convinced her to draw Brandon out under false pretenses. The moment Brandon stepped onto the property, Lawless opened fire. 6 shots hit Brandon at close range. 2 bullets struck Trinity. One severed her spinal cord and penetrated her brainstem. it was instantly fatal. Neighbors heard the gunshots and called police. When officers arrived, they found Brandon and Trinity dead at the scene. The brutality stunned even seasoned investigators. This wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It looked like an execution. Surveillance footage from nearby homes captured a Chrysler 200 arriving minutes before the shooting and fleeing just seconds afterward. Witnesses identified the driver as Evan Ross, an acquaintance who prosecutors said knowingly transported Lawless to the scene. Lawless already had a violent history. In 2015, he had been convicted of attempted murder and was on parole at the time of the killings. That fact alone raised uncomfortable questions about supervision and oversight. Within days, Lawless was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, burglary, and related offenses. Evan Ross later pleaded guilty to facilitation to murder in exchange for his testimony. Lawless's teenage girlfriend also testified, describing how she had been used to lure Brandon outside. In July 2021, Lawless posted bond, an outcome that outraged the community, especially given the death of a child. His release lasted less than 2 weeks. He was rearrested for violating parole related to his earlier conviction and remained incarcerated. The trial began in September 2022. Prosecutors laid out a detailed narrative of premeditation. They presented surveillance footage, cell phone records, witness testimony, and forensic analysis. Ross testified that he drove Lawless to the house knowing something bad was about to happen. The girlfriend testified about being manipulated into setting the trap. The defense attacked the credibility of those witnesses, emphasizing plea deals and incentives to lie. They argued the case was circumstantial and built on unreliable testimony. After 2 rounds of deliberations, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. During the penalty phase, prosecutors sought the death penalty, emphasizing Trinity's age and innocence. The jury declined to recommend death, instead opting for life without parole. On November 3, 2022, Lawless was formally sentenced to life in prison. For Brandon's family and Trinity's mother, it felt like justice finally. But the case was far from over. During the trial, a dramatic moment unfolded. Evan Ross, the prosecution's key witness, was caught lying on the stand. The judge accused him of perjury in open court and ordered his immediate arrest on camera. That decision would unravel everything. That evening, a juror saw news coverage of Ross's arrest despite explicit instructions to avoid media. The juror shared the information with others during deliberations. When the judge learned this, one juror was dismissed and replaced with an alternate. The trial continued. The verdict stood, but Lawless's attorneys immediately appealed. Because the sentence was life imprisonment, the appeal went directly to the Kentucky Supreme Court. In October 2025, the court issued a stunning decision. The conviction was overturned. The justices ruled that once jurors were exposed to news of the judge arresting a key witness for perjury, the trial became fundamentally unfair. The judge's public actions and the media exposure irreparably tainted the jury. Substituting an alternate juror was not enough. 2 justices dissented, arguing that the evidence against Lawless was overwhelming and that a mistrial was unnecessary. But the majority prevailed. The verdict was vacated. Lawless remained in custody, but the case was reset. For the families, the ruling felt like a second betrayal. They had endured the investigation, the trial, the sentencing, and now they were told it all had to happen again. The Commonwealth's attorney announced plans to retry the case. Prosecutors stated they would present the same evidence, minus the mistakes that derailed the first trial. A new trial was expected in 2026. For Trinity's mother, the process was re-traumatizing. Every hearing reopened wounds that never healed. She remembered a laughing toddler who loved princess shoes and sang along to movie songs, gone not because of accident, but because of adult choices. For Brandon's family, the loss was just as raw. A young father trying to protect his child was taken in seconds. As of late 2025, Kayvon Lawless remained incarcerated awaiting retrial. He had been convicted once and might be convicted again, but the delay underscored a painful truth. Justice is not just about guilt. It's about procedure. And when procedure fails, even the strongest cases can collapse. He was getting ready for a first date with Miss Ohio USA. Ryan Poston was 29 years old, handsome, intelligent, and widely seen as someone destined for success. He worked as an attorney in Cincinnati, had attended elite schools, and was known among friends as kind, principled, and ambitious. Some joked they would run his future political campaign for free. That future ended on the night of October 12, 2012. Ryan had plans to meet Audrey Bolte, the reigning Miss Ohio USA. It was supposed to be a fresh start, but before he could leave his condominium in Highland Heights, Kentucky, someone else arrived. Shayna Hubers. At 21 years old, Shayna appeared impressive on paper. She had graduated with honors in just 3 years and was pursuing a master's degree in school counseling at the University of Kentucky. Friends remembered her as brilliant and driven. But her relationship with Ryan had become volatile. They had been on again, off again, for nearly 18 months. Ryan repeatedly tried to end things. Text messages showed him asking her to stop contacting him, warning that her behavior was approaching restraining order territory. In response, Shayna sent more than 100 messages in a single night. She refused to let go. That evening, Shayna was inside Ryan's condo when an argument occurred. Around 10 p.m., she called 911 and claimed she had shot Ryan in self-defense. When police arrived, they found Ryan lying on the living room floor. He had been shot 6 times, twice in the face, along with wounds to his head, arm, and torso. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive injuries on Shayna. The scene didn't match her story. At the police station, Shayna waived her right to an attorney and began talking freely. What she said stunned investigators. She pointed to her nose and said, "I shot him right here. I gave him his nose job." She explained that Ryan had always wanted a nose job and now she had given it to him by shooting him in the face. She worried aloud whether anyone would want to marry her now. When officers left her alone in the interrogation room, surveillance cameras captured behavior that would later be shown to juries across the country. Shayna paced. She danced. She waved her finger and sang. At one point, she chanted, "I did it. Yes, I did it. I can't believe I did that." When officers re-entered, she cried instantly, then stopped the moment they left again. Prosecutors believed they were watching performance, not remorse. Their theory was simple obsession and rejection. Evidence showed Ryan had been trying to move on. His upcoming date represented freedom. Shayna couldn't accept it. In one chilling text to a friend, she had fantasized about going to a shooting range with Ryan and then turning around and shooting him, making it look like an accident. In April 2015, a jury found Shayna Hubers guilty of murder. She was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The judge described the killing as one of the coldest acts he had encountered. Ryan's family felt some measure of closure. Then, everything fell apart. In 2016, Shayna's conviction was overturned after it was discovered that one juror was a convicted felon, legally ineligible to serve. She was granted a new trial. The retrial began in August 2018 with a new defense strategy. This time, Shayna testified herself. Her attorney argued extreme emotional disturbance, claiming Ryan had emotionally manipulated her and driven her into psychological collapse. A psychologist testified that she suffered from borderline personality disorder. Prosecutors countered with text messages, timelines, and the interrogation footage. They argued the killing was calculated, 4 shots fired, then 2 more to finish him. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found her guilty again. This time they recommended life in prison. In October 2018, Shayna Hubers was sentenced to life with parole eligibility after 20 years. During sentencing, Ryan's father delivered a powerful statement about the pain of losing his son and watching his death become public spectacle. Today, Shayna remains incarcerated at the Kentucky Correctional Institution for Women. She will be eligible for parole in the early 2030s. Her case became a national example of how obsession can masquerade as love, and how rejection, when combined with emotional instability, can turn deadly. She was 18 years old when she disappeared. Jessica Curran was a young mother living in Mayfield, Kentucky, in the summer of 2000. She had an infant son, a close-knit family, and a life that, despite its challenges, still held possibility. On the night of July 29th, she went out with friends. She never came home. 3 days later, on August 1st, a teacher tending plants behind Mayfield Middle School made a horrifying discovery. Lying in the grass was a burned, decomposed body. Dental records confirmed what Jessica's family already feared. It was her. A black braided belt found near the remains led investigators to believe Jessica had been strangled. The condition of her body made it impossible to determine much else. From the beginning, the investigation was chaotic. Multiple agencies rotated in and out. Evidence went missing. Leads collapsed. Two early suspects were arrested, Jessica's boyfriend and another local man. Charges were later dropped after critical evidence disappeared. The case stalled. For 6 years, no one was held responsible. Then, in 2004, something unusual happened. Two civilians inserted themselves into the investigation, Susan Galbraith, a local housewife, and Tom Mangold, a BBC journalist. Obsessed with solving the case, they conducted their own inquiry, interviewing witnesses, recording conversations, and applying pressure that law enforcement never could. Eventually, 3 teenage girls came forward with shocking claims. They accused Quincy Omar Cross, a young man from Tennessee, of killing Jessica. According to their testimony, Jessica had been taken to a house where Cross allegedly assaulted and strangled her with a belt. They claimed her body was later hidden and burned behind the school. Quincy Cross denied everything. He said he had never met Jessica Curran. He claimed he was in Union City, Tennessee, the night she disappeared, and had an alibi. He pointed out that he had been arrested the next morning on a minor drug charge before Jessica's body was even discovered. But prosecutors focused on one detail. When Cross was arrested, he wasn't wearing a belt. Witnesses claimed he had been seen waving a belt at a party the night before. That belt became central to the prosecution's case, despite the fact that forensic experts could not definitively link it to the one found near Jessica's body. In 2008, Quincy Cross stood trial. There was no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, no physical proof tying him to the crime scene. The case rested almost entirely on witness testimony that had changed multiple times over the years. Before trial, the 3 teenage witnesses pleaded guilty to evidence tampering and abuse of a corpse in exchange for testifying. The defense argued their stories were coerced, inconsistent, and motivated by fear of harsher punishment. The jury believed them. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, Quincy Cross was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Cross maintained his innocence. Years passed. Then slowly the case began to unravel. One witness recanted signing an affidavit stating she had lied at trial and had no knowledge of Jessica's murder. Another recanted during a recorded phone call. A third followed. All 3 claimed they had been pressured by investigators and outside parties threatened with prison and promised reward money. New testimony emerged. An incarcerated man stated that another original suspect had bragged about killing his girlfriend in Mayfield, details matching Jessica's case. That man later encountered Quincy Cross in prison and realized the wrong person may have been convicted. In 2025, the Kentucky Innocence Project and the Exoneration Project secured an evidentiary hearing. Witnesses testified about missing evidence, shifting narratives, and investigative misconduct. Perhaps most striking of all was the voice calling for Cross's release. Jessica Curran's father. After years of reviewing the evidence himself, he publicly stated he believed Quincy Cross was innocent. 2 fathers, one who lost a daughter and one who lost a son to prison, stood together united by a belief that justice had failed both their families. As of late 2025, Quincy Cross remains incarcerated, but momentum has shifted. A judge is expected to rule on whether his conviction should be vacated or a new trial granted. The case now stands as a haunting question. What happens when the system is more focused on closing a case than getting it right? For Jessica Curran, true justice means identifying who really took her life. For Quincy Cross, it means the chance to finally prove he didn't. And for Mayfield, Kentucky, it means confronting the possibility that for more than 2 decades, an innocent man may have been locked away while the truth remained buried. 10 cases, 10 different crimes, 10 moments where ordinary days turn into permanent tragedies. At first glance, these stories may seem disconnected. A bank employee, a high school student, a hospital orderly, a missing mother, a rejected lover, a child caught in the crossfire, different places, different years, different circumstances. But beneath the surface, they are bound together by something far more unsettling. Each case reveals not just an act of violence, but a failure, sometimes personal, sometimes systemic, often both. In Connor Sturgeon's case, warning signs existed long before the first shot was fired, yet no mechanism stopped him. In Michael Carneal's severe mental illness went untreated until it exploded inside a school hallway. Donald Harvey operated for years in hospitals because no one believed the pattern they were seeing. Ronald Exantis walked free not because his victims were forgotten, but because the law allowed it. Crystal Rogers vanished into silence for nearly a decade, her family forced to become investigators just to be heard. Joshua Cottrell's past violence didn't disappear, it waited. Shane Ragland's conviction collapsed, not because the truth was disproven, but because procedure failed. Kevin Lawless's case showed how even a guilty verdict can be undone by a single misstep. Shina Huber's demonstrated how obsession can masquerade as love until it turns lethal. And Quincy Cross reminds us that sometimes the system's greatest crime is certainty in the absence of proof. What's most disturbing is not just what happened, but how often it could have been prevented. A question not asked, a report not taken seriously, a pattern dismissed as coincidence, a loophole written into law. And when the cameras shut off, when the trials end, when the public moves on, the real consequences remain with the families. Empty bedrooms, unanswered phones, birthdays that never come, children who grow up without parents, parents who grow old without answers. True crime is often consumed as entertainment, but these stories were never meant to be consumed lightly. They are warnings about what happens when mental health is ignored, when power goes unchecked, when justice becomes procedural instead of human. Because behind every case number is a name, behind every verdict is a family, and behind every headline is a life that can never be restored. Justice, when it comes, is often imperfect. Sometimes it arrives late, sometimes it arrives incomplete, and sometimes it never arrives at all. But remembering these stories fully, honestly, and without distortion is one of the few things that can still be done. Not for shock, not for spectacle, but so the silence that allowed these crimes to happen does not repeat itself. Because the most dangerous moment is not when violence occurs. It's when we stop paying attention,